To understand the mistakes that Rings of Power made prior to its release that upset its potential fans and really created a sort of negative context for its consumption, we need to understand a little bit about what fans and franchises really are, what purposes they serve, and what the relationship is between them. I'm Logan, author of the Intensely Casual Guide to Good Story, and this is Intensely Casual. So the first thing we need to realize is that the idea of fans has not always existed, right? There's no such thing, or at least there wasn't in his time, there was no such thing as a Beethoven fan or a Shakespeare fan. Fandom is a phenomenon specifically of modernity and industrialization, and emerged initially from the worlds of sports in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The Industrial Revolution pulled people out of their traditional communities where you could assume everyone had the same customs and values as you, and put them into these huge cities where people of wildly different customs and values, even if they were sort of ethnically homogenous, all had to mix in different neighborhoods. And again, that's if they were ethnically homogenous. If you start taking people of different ethnicities and from different parts of the world, put in the same neighborhoods, it becomes even more challenging. That was the environment fandom was born in. The origin of the term in the 19th century comes from comparing supporters of sports teams to religious fanatics. Fanatic shortened to fan. And the idea is that they're peculiarly devoted to their particular club or team, right? So, for example, a Yankees fan isn't just someone who loves baseball and happens to live near where the Yankees are, but is a member of a specific community of people who love the Yankees. This sense of community is so important that I have known many sports fans who participate in their fandom for the love of the community more than for any actual love of the game. Fandoms can organize around individuals, of course. And in fact, a prominent individual is an important part of any fandom. But the most enduring fandoms are those that organize around a franchise, something that becomes greater than any given one person. At Intensely Casual, we use the term franchise really specifically to refer to any business that implicitly sells a membership in a community in addition to whatever else it does. Okay, so it sells membership in a group based on shared experiences and narratives. One becomes a fan by not just buying the product, but by participating in that franchise's shared narrative. This is true of sports teams. It's true of luxury products in particular. In fact, this is where a lot of my information on this is coming from, is a book called The Luxury Strategy, which was about luxury brands, but even they realized it wasn't just luxury brands that used this strategy. And frankly, I think what they described was the business strategy of any franchise business. Of course, if fans are like religious fanatics, that makes the franchises around which they organize themselves a bit like religions. And all successful franchises share two things in common with religions. First, a successful franchise always has at least one founder or hero character that sort of forms the basis of the story, that people can identify as their shared hero, shared symbolic leader. And then they also need to provide a shared story that the fans can become part of. And the truth is, either of these things may or may not be real. Think here of Optimus Prime and the Transformers. Prime is the character around which the whole series revolves. He is the symbolic leader of the Transformers franchise. And yet neither the Transformers nor Prime are real. And yet people still find shared community and experience in watching the Transformers and, from playing with the toys, particularly when they're children. Actually, Transformers was a really important moment in the formation of franchise stories, something I'll talk to you about some other day. Now, this happens whenever humans form communities around shared myths and stories. It isn't something that leaders or business owners need to cultivate. Don't get me wrong, they can cultivate this in the way that Steve Jobs did with Apple in creating a business that is very, very much a franchise for many of its devotees. But it can also happen pretty spontaneously, as it did with George Lucas with Star Wars, and to some extent with J.K. Rowling with Harry Potter. Neither of those people understood that when they were making their creative work, what they were creating was a franchise. This relationship between fan and franchise exists because it's just a new version of how humans have always formed tribes and communities since prehistory. This is what makes a franchise valuable. The Detroit Lions can afford to be bad at football because the real value of the Lions franchise is the shared community of Lions fans. Sure, Lions fans hope the Lions will be good each year, but the real value of being a Lions fan is in the community that is sharing the same experience, even if the experience is one of frustration and suffering. This is the key. If you don't like that the Lions are bad at football, you can't just switch to another team. If you have fond memories of going to a Lions game and have friends who are Lions fans, you won't be able to trigger those memories or find the same community amongst fans of some other team. This is an amazing financial power, but it comes with some unavoidable limits. Limits that are a necessary consequence of the power of incomparability. To understand these limits, let's think about why Cherry Coke, which was introduced in 1985, is still around, is still a product you can buy. But New Coke, which was also introduced in 1985, isn't. See, Coke's customers were willing to tolerate a change to their Coke, a new kind of Coke, an expansion of their Coca-Cola choices. But they could never tolerate replacing classic Coca-Cola with a new one, because the flavor of the new Coke couldn't evoke the same memories and feelings of being a child on a hot summer's day and drinking an ice-cold Coca-Cola with your grandpa. It could not create that same sense of community. It could not evoke that feeling of community. And people will often use the word nostalgia here. I don't like nostalgia. I generally prefer the term familiarity. But quite often, what people are getting at when they say nostalgia, it's not the feeling of nostalgia. It is the feeling of community. The community that is at the heart of what makes a franchise valuable to both the franchise owner and the fan of the franchise. This is the mistake Amazon made when promoting Rings of Power. It wasn't diversity casting. In fact, let's be clear, I actually think the cast of Rings of Power are really good. And in fact, and I probably wouldn't have thought of it this way if I hadn't been forced to by the promotion of Rings of Power, the minority actors are probably the best actors. That having been said, people don't really mind diversity casting at all. Think here of the race swaps so that Samuel L. Jackson could play Nick Fury in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or the gender swap and probable race swap in Dune of Dr. Liet Kynes, who was probably envisioned as a white male when Dune was written, but was played in the movie by a black woman. Or, for that matter, the rampant race and gender swapping that went on in Neil Gaiman's Sandman Season 1 up on Netflix right now. In all cases, there really wasn't much of a controversy because these choices didn't disrespect the fundamental nature of the established stories or their key mythic figures. Amazon could have respected Tolkien and had diversity casting. For one thing, they could have just not talked about the diversity casting. I mean, as everyone's doing it right now, there was in many ways nothing special about that. They could have said also that they cast diverse actors because they wanted the best actors to bring their story to life. They could also simply have said that modern storytelling just requires a diverse cast, and the audience would just have to get used to this as a convention and suspend their disbelief. Now, we don't normally believe in the suspension of disbelief at Intensely Casual, but one way you can get past disbelief, you can suspend it, is by just learning to accept something unrealistic as a convention. This has happened a couple times in the history of film, say how people accepted silent movies because sound was just not available, and then later on people accepted black and white movies because color was fundamentally not available. There are a lot of things that could have been said. Instead, Amazon took the line that Tolkien needed to be updated. They didn't just do diversity casting, they made it the heart of the project, that they were doing important work by casting minorities in these roles in a traditionally white franchise. And even that might have been okay, except they also kept using terms like, or saying things like, the his stories need to be reimagined and rewoven. while otherwise not discussing the story they want to tell, not making it clear in what way they plan to reweave these stories. Even the final preview gave few hints of what the show was actually going to be about. They have every legal right to do what they did with the license that they purchased for a reported $250 million. But like so many companies in the story franchise now, or honestly even in the past, Amazon seems not to understand that what made that license so valuable is that the Tolkien stories live rent-free in the minds of millions of passionate fans. Fans would have accepted the diverse casting. What they could not accept was the explanation that implied that the world of Tolkien wasn't just going to be brought to life and expanded so much as it was going to be rewritten and undone. This would have been lethal for practically any franchise, but it was especially so for Tolkien, as his work is one of a handful of works that aren't just a franchise of their own, but form a backbone of modern Western nerd culture, making it one of the most holy and sacred, in a very secular way, franchises. In the Guide to Good Story, I write that context may be the most important of the three dimensions that provide value, because it is the gatekeeper of all other experiences. By insulting the fans and the franchise before the show is released, Amazon triggered a cognitive bias called the affect heuristic, which meant that people, now that they were angry about what was going on, they were more sensitive to the show's flaws and less sensitive, and in fact, in some ways blinded to any good points the show might have, which it does have. But Amazon and the show's creators have no right to complain. It is this quasi-religious passion and devotion that made the property worth the price they paid for it in the first place. But this loyalty is not totally unlimited. It requires the value of this property requires a shared narrative. A franchise has enormous power to compel a captive fandom to consume its product. But fans will only remain loyal to the franchise so long as the franchise maintains at least lip service loyalty to the narrative that has been sold to fans. Think here of Gene Roddenberry. Up until his death, Star Trek was always like, oh yeah, Gene Roddenberry's really involved, even though quite often what they just did was they paid him a salary and put him in an office and ignored him. They at least paid the lip service. Once the franchise rejects its established narrative or its founder, it actually breaks its connection to the fans and it loses all value. You might as well have just created an original property, because the original property would then be judged on its own merits. New Coke did not fail because it was unpleasant to drink. It failed because it was viewed as a counterfeit, as an imposter compared to the Coca-Cola it was replacing. It would literally have been more valuable in this case to create a new property than to create a property that sounded like it wasn't authentically Tolkien. So why don't they? Well, because these companies aren't seeking so much success as safety. They're trying to manage the huge risks they're taking on these big budget projects. They don't so much want to win but not lose. Like a football team that, rather than trying to get the ball back, a football team in the lead, rather than trying to get the ball back and really just close out the win, instead tries to preserve the lead by playing a prevent defense. But to quote my favorite TV show, The Good Place, the main thing a prevent defense prevents is winning. So why does this failing approach to franchises appeal so much to the companies making stories? Why does it make them feel safer? That I'm going to have to address next week. If you want to hear about it, please subscribe, like this video. A lot of this information comes from my book, The Guide to Good Story. There are links to where you can buy The Guide to Good Story in the video description. All this and more is laid out in that book, so if you're in a rush to get this information, that's the place to look for it. Also, check out our podcast, The Intensely Casual Commentaries, which are DVD-style movie-length commentaries and movies where we apply the Guide to Good Story, the Intensely Casual method, to the movies we're watching, usually with some particular focus on some aspect of the Intensely Casual method for evaluating stories. But until next time, remember, if you feel like you have to buy or watch something, you're not a customer, you're a captive.